You have macro history, what we usually learn in school, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, American Revolution, all these big things, big personalities. But the stories of the individuals, you have to dig for that. That's where you learn what people's lives were actually like. The mosquitoes were just horrific. There was a sailor who jumped off a ship one day because he couldn't take it anymore. People will be shocked to find out Sam Houston was not loved by everyone. Death is always around every corner.
Welcome to Galveston Unscripted. In this episode today, I sit down with historian and author Mr. James Valentino. We discuss his work and research into those early days of Galveston, back in the 1830s and 1840s. One big reason I wanted to have James on the podcast is because of one of the books he's published, and that is From Maine to Galveston, Republic of Texas, The Life and Letters of Lucy Parker Shaw. James stumbled upon these letters while doing genealogical research, and once he discovered the beautifully written descriptions of early Galveston, he knew he needed to do something about it. So he published these letters a few years ago, and we sat down to discuss what he discovered along the way. What I really enjoy about the letters in this book, written by Miss Lucy Parker Shaw, are the beautiful, long-winded descriptions of what the island was like back in the 1830s and 40s. They really capture the grit of frontier life and what it was really like back in those early days, right here on Galveston Island. Welcome to Galveston Unscripted.
Those guys are not book buyers, though. The girls are, though.
What group are the biggest book buyers for you?
Well, definitely the girls there probably sold a fourth of them a book. You know what I mean? Something like that.
Yeah.
Probably one out of every four people there bought a book, which is big deal, percentage-wise, I think.
Yeah.
Even in Maine, I didn't sell a lot of books. And everyone in Eastport, where I give the talk, very interested. They were very interested in Texas. And even though I was doing, the talk was about this girl who came from their hometown, they were more interested in Texas and Galveston and what happened there. And I found myself talking more about the Texas City disaster and the hurricane of, 1900 hurricane than I was doing with the talking about her.
You're trying to talk about 1838,
I was
and they're
trying to talk about
1947.
1838, and they wanted to talk about,
That's
they were just
wild.
fascinated by Texas and this kind of stuff, actually.
Oh, I got you a water, by the way, so one of these waters is for you if you want it.
Yeah, I drag all that. What's the Patriot?
Oh, The Patriot, yes.
Yeah, the Patriot movie.
Yeah. You know what movie they should have done instead of The Patriot? The Bernardo de Galvez story.
Yeah, that might be something interesting.
The way Bernardo de Galvez and his team moved across the Gulf Coast
Right.
during the American Revolution for Spain. But it's so important to the American story.
Yeah.
It's literally pivotal to the American story to get the British off of the Gulf Coast, but nobody ever tells that story, It's
Yeah, I
kind
know.
of
It's
one of those
wonder why.
swept under the rug.
It's interesting what catches on in history and really what doesn't. There's a lot of hidden stories out there, like Lucy Shaw or whatever, kind of like things that just people, I don't know for what reason. Maybe it's just his name, Bernardo de Galvez is.
Yeah, if only they named a city after him. That'd be nice.
Yeah, that would be nice if they did name a city after him. Yeah. Nobody even thinks about the name of how Galveston got its name, do they?
Not really. Not
No.
really. But it's obviously from him. But,
Oh, yeah.
James, could you tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into it here?
I was born in actually San Leon, but then as I was a kid, little bitty kid, like 3 years old, we moved to Bayview because it was like we thought it. My mom insisted on moving. My father was a commercial fisherman, and so he was a shrimper. He also though worked for shell dredging companies in the '50s, and that's where he really made he made a living. That kind of made him in a way. He still continued in that business, and he and my brother bought into Eagle Point, so I had been around that life. At one point, my dad had 2 Gulf boats where he fished them out of Grosso's, which is down from 19th Street. You think of the Mosquito Fleet there and all that. Grosso's was a little farther down. I can't remember the street. 14th, somewhere along in there. All I remember is sitting on his boat looking across the street at what they used to tell me was the insane asylum or whatever, the psych ward with the big red building or whatever they call it. Yeah. And so I always kind of got in, that was something that was always there. And so when I got out of high school, I bought a boat and I did all that kind of stuff. I bought and sold oysters for a few years. Made a little money doing that. That was all right business for a while. That kind of business kind of started getting a downturn. I really couldn't keep up with it anymore. I was getting older. And I went back to school with the money I sold and leaning on my wife's income. She was making more money all the time. So I went back to school and I got my bachelor's degree and then my master's degree. And what the hell do you do with a worthless history degree?
Oh, no.
I started hired on at College of the Mainland as an adjunct, and I've been doing that ever since. And in the meantime, I would, because of the research, you have to learn how to do research and all this kind of stuff, which I kind of really enjoyed. And I started writing little stories, and one of the first little books I have is a book about Eagle Point. That's the piece of property, and I found some very interesting things, and I wrote a little thing about it, self-published it. It really was just more for, I guess, practice or fun. It's a little thin book about Eagle Point. And then I wrote another book that's just stories that my dad told me or this or that about Galveston-based stuff. And then I wrote this. And of course I realized if anybody else is going to be interested in my stuff, it wasn't really the first two things, really, honestly. Although I didn't like my book of stories. I think there's some good stuff in there.
What put you on my radar is I was doing research on a couple different things, and I don't remember exactly what it was, whether I was doing research on Shaw, one of the men who named the Strand. His last name was Shaw because my last name is Shaw. And I think I was Googling or just looking Shaw Galveston just to see if there were any connections because my mom's from Louisiana, my dad's from Michigan, but I was like, well, maybe there are extended connections somehow tying me back to Galveston. But of course, this was probably 2020. And your book had been out for a few years, so it started to show up in the Google results. I saw your book, and I was like, I've got to get this. So I went down to the bookstore over here and bought From Maine to Galveston, Republic of Texas. For those who don't know, it's a series of letters from a woman named Lucy Parker Shaw, who moved from Maine to Galveston in 1838.
They're all letters to her mother in Maine. We don't have her responses back, and we don't have all of the letters. Because there's two or three gaps in there of 2 or 3 years that there are no letters, and I don't know where they are, if they even exist. They were kept by the Love family in Houston because they were related to Emily. That's how they kind of trace back. I believe that's how they traced their lineage back through Emily, which was her infant daughter that came with them. Her husband, Joshua, was from Bath. Yeah, they arrived in 1838. She died in 1850 in the Tremont Hotel, the one that burned down in 1865. And so they run for those about 12 years. The last letter she wrote, I think, was a few months before her death.
And this book is absolutely fascinating if you're interested in not only Galveston history, but Texas history.
Yes.
And the way it connects the other parts of the world to Galveston and Texas, because you got to wonder why so many people were leaving Maine at that time and coming down here. Hey, if you're still watching, I just want to say thank you very much. If you enjoy podcasts or history content like this, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, head on over to the YouTube channel and make sure to subscribe. We've got hours and hours of Galveston, Texas, and American history content on that YouTube channel. All right, back to the show. But really what I want to start at is your interest in even writing this book. How did you, what was the thread you pulled to get you in on this book?
I started the project when I was doing other research at Rosenberg. So I used to go in there quite often and doing research for various things, my Eagle Point thing at first, and then other projects. I would go down there and ask for things. And one day I was looking, I don't even remember what it was, but I was looking through their card catalog thing. You pull in and look through the little index things. And I saw a Shaw, and I said, you know what, one of my relatives told me that we're related to some people in Galveston named Shaw. Didn't know anything about any of that. And I saw this one, and it said Lucy 30 letter or 29 letters, whatever it was. And I said, oh, okay. So I had them pull it for me. And I sat there and started reading through a few. And I thought, this is interesting. And then when I came back, a week later or so, I had them pull it again. And over a period of probably looking at them 5 or 6, 7 times, reading through them, I kept coming across people that she knew, people that she met, historical events, things like that, and realized this is not just mundane ideas of, just general talk about your neighbors or things like that. But she was mentioning things to her mother about what was going on the Galveston that she called her strange little island. Okay?
It hasn't changed. It's still a strange little island.
And so she describes the island and things that are happening and the political events that are happening. And she describes it in a way that's very exciting, but I can also see where it was a very troubled place. She'd left out a lot of the danger. You got to realize in the letters, she didn't want to upset her mother too much about what was going on, but she does talk about political events and the death of people that they knew, some people from Maine as well as people around here. Her child, when she dies, is very touching letter to tell her mother that her infant died.
I read that part today.
Yeah, it's sad, very sad. She talks about, let's say, for example, the death of Ambassador Flood. That's also pretty interesting. The charge d'affaires from the United States to the Republic of Texas stayed in the Tremont when they were running it. And so he knew her. She knew him. She knew lots of people. I have a list of all just the interesting people that she talked to. I mean, it's impressive. A list of people that she met, running a hotel like this where people stay in there. And the thing about Lucy, if you read her letters, these are not an uneducated woman. She knows her stuff. She has political ideas, political notions. She lets you in on occasionally, if you read carefully enough, social ideas about religion and education. Of course, her father, Jonathan Weston, was an attorney in Eastport. As a matter of fact, if you want to read an early history of Eastport, I know everyone is out there would want to instantly read this history of Eastport, Maine. He wrote a history about it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. But he died in his 30s. Mm-hmm. He was a young man when he died. He was a lawyer, and he sent her and her brother. She had a brother named William, and he sent them to Boston. And she was tutored there by a tutor. He paid for them to get educated. So there's some indication. She knew her Greek and Latin, and like a lot of people back then, the key to being an educated person. Right?
It comes across really well that she's very well educated. And
she is very well educated.
The long-winded, not in a bad way, but the long-winded descriptions.
Yes.
It almost paint a picture of what it was like here in 1838, 1839, 1840.
Yes.
And you're like, wow, you can almost imagine, the flat, sandy island that this was at that time,
Yes.
So why were people moving from Maine to Galveston?
A couple of reasons. When you study that period of time, actually pre-Revolutionary War on, New England was getting full. We don't think of it like that. But even Maine is either timber land, the farming prospects in Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, you think it's all so great? No, it's lousy. The ground is usually poor. It's either forest land. The arable land is really not a lot. And as people were born, this is why New England was spilled over, of course, back into Ohio, and why people were moving out that way. A little sidebar that I tell my class about that they seem to enjoy hearing is that illegitimacy rates before the American Revolution were quite high in New England. The reason being, a father would require that any suitor for his daughter be ready to take over and provide her with a suitable income and home and whatever, so that he could take care of her and children. Guys couldn't do it. There wasn't any land to buy. What land there was, you couldn't grow anything on it. In Maine, they grow a lot of potatoes because you can grow potato anywhere. As the population kind of grew, like in Greece, they had to get off. That's one thing. Another thing is that in 1837, we had a banking collapse in 1837. This has ruined the administration of Martin Van Buren. Wasn't reelected because the economy went to garbage, and they blamed it on him. So people were moving around, right? They went bankrupt. My guess is that Joshua, whose father founded basically Bath, Maine, found that his prospects weren't very good. He and his brother James had come to this part of the world a year or two earlier. I guess looked around. James stayed here. Joshua went back and got his wife and numerous other relatives. Okay, his father had passed away, so he got his second wife, and they just came here, a new place to go.
Yeah, and you got to think, I guess the revolution had just happened a couple years prior to them arriving.
Yes. Mm-hmm. James, Joshua's brother, was the secretary to Commodore Moore in the Texas Navy.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes a lot. He was probably involved, and he was definitely involved.
Yes, and then later on, she talks about even later when she was here, and they had this expedition against the Indians or something, right? And he was off on it. Never found out. Never been able to find out what happened to James.
You found these letters at the Rosenberg Library, and obviously you're reading into them, and you really enjoy the picture they're painting of Galveston.
I'm fascinating as an historian what I'm discovering in them. Famous people or people that I realize that I should know, but I don't really know that much about. So I started looking into different varying figures that were in there. I needed to print them out. I did not know what to do with them. My first idea, I started writing notes on each letter, thinking, there's so much information, and the people are interesting. And she's mentioning Sam Houston and Dr. Smith and this Cyrus Hamlin guy, and I started, investigating them, and McKinney and all these people and Galveston people. So I started making notes on them and excerpts, and I figured out this is going to be forever. I'll never be able to do this. I need the letters. And so why try to write something in an abbreviated form about the letters? Just publish the letters. I started looking around and found out that there was a woman named Miss Henson, a professor at University of Houston, Clear Lake, when I went there, that had passed on, but she had collected them. She was a Texas history buff, and she wrote she wrote books and things about Texas history, and she had the letters and had donated all of her stuff to Texas A&M Galveston. So I went to Texas A&M Galveston. As soon as I told them, they were like, oh, yeah, we got them things. We're over here. You want us to print a few? And I said, no, how about print them, all of them? Oh, okay. So that's where I got the letters. The letters had been transcribed from the originals. The Loves, a family that were related to Lucy, were interested in that history, their family history, and they had the letters. Oh, wow. They were not in Maine. They were in Houston or Pasadena, where they lived. And somebody had transcribed them, typed them out, and so I didn't have to go and try to transcribe those things.
Yeah, that's got to be tough. That handwriting is so...
Yeah. I found one other letter, because I was in contact with people in the Eastport Historical Society, and somebody who had a home there and had relatives who had lived there but now was living in California, a family law judge, of all things, in a town outside of San Francisco, contacted me, and I got to talking to her, texting her back and forth, and she had a letter. She wanted the letters, right, because she didn't have them. So I sent them to them, and she said, there's one that I have that you don't have. So I got one extra one from her.
Nice.
Mary Grove in California.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually have one letter that they don't have.
But in this book, you don't have any of the return letters that she received.
No, never been able to find. Never. Never have found them and never found either the letters. And that probably is more on me but it would require me to travel.
Of course, yeah.
If somebody else has them, they're not going to be kept. I'm not going to find them in Houston because the Loves give up everything whatever they had.
Mm-hmm.
Mary Grove had one. But that kind of it led me to believe that there may be others out there, because if Mary had one, there may be others. They're either held somewhere. I looked in the Eastport library. They have nothing. But I didn't go through the Calais, Maine library. She knew people in Calais, Maine, so I'm thinking they have a Bear Historical Society. They're somewhere. I really do believe that whoever kept them, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does.
And there must have been missing years. They're missing years. And there's a reason for that. I don't know why they got moved around, or somebody, I think, somewhere those letters are out there.
You know, it kind of highlights the significance of keeping old documents sometimes, like old documents like letters and notes, because you never know the insights they can provide.
Absolutely. As time goes
years
by
later,
and times change, using is how history just goes on and on. One thing that I think is interesting about this type of history, you have macro history, what we usually learn in school, the big things. You get George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, American Revolution, George III, about Franklin Roosevelt, LB, all these big things, big personalities, wars, depressions, movements, things like that. But the stories of the individuals, we don't really know very much about. You have to dig for that. And that's kind of like the micro history. And that's where you learn what people's lives were actually like. And you not only get some of the big picture thing in these letters, because she talks about things that are happening in the Republic, for good and for bad, but then her day-to-day lives, you get to see how life really was. And you begin to realize through those letters, number one, the first thing that hits you is that life can be short. Death is always around every corner, whether it's a storm or somebody's going to shoot you, or a yellow fever, or you just get sick and there's nothing to help you. There's no antibiotics. She discusses probably five different doctors that she had. She likes doctors. She's a kind of scientific mind. She wants to do what's latest in everything. And yet, many times there's really nothing that they can do to help. Her child dies, and she brings in 2 or 3 doctors, and there's really nothing that they can do.
Mm-hmm. And I read that section today, and one of the doctors had been quarantining for some illness or some type of sickness that was going around the island at that time.
Right.
So doctors were going in and getting sick, and it's one of those things that paints that picture. And even when she's writing that letter, it's only maybe a week removed from when her child dies, but the way she's writing about it, you don't really you feel sorrow.
Right.
You can feel the sorrow.
Right.
But I can't imagine writing a letter like that a week removed from my 9-month-old dying,
Right.
But
you know what? You have to go on.
You have to move on.
We know that's your life this could always be the last day. We take that a little bit for granted, thinking, oh yeah, well, they'll rush you to the hospital, give us some blood, give us some whatever, and pump us up, and it'll be all right. Death is a shock today when it does happen. When people die young, but back then people died like that all the time. She talks about suicide. People think suicide would be something more contemporary, and yet suicides were quite common in that era. You don't have painkillers that like you do today, or things to ease your pain or whatever.
Yeah.
People just can't live with it no more and end it. Yeah. And so she talks about a couple of suicides that happen in there that are kind of shocking. She describes a buggy ride or something on the beach. And sometimes it's kind of lovely, right? But she also describes all of the rattlesnakes on the island, the mosquitoes that are literally, I think at one point she wrote a letter to her mother, said, you can't imagine, they torment you day and night without a mosquito net, you can forget it. That she claimed that there was a sailor, I don't know if you read that, but there was a sailor who jumped off a ship one day and drowned himself because he couldn't take it anymore. The mosquitoes were just horrific.
Yeah, she describes even when they leave Maine, she's writing back to her mother talking about the
Yes.
journey. And then when they arrive at the opening to Galveston Bay
Yes.
on the ship, they had to hail a pilot to get them into the
Yes.
channel. And
Right.
they have to wait a couple days, I believe, and then they end up talking to another ship that's coming by.
Yeah.
I think from England or something, and they end up towing them partially, and then they get a pilot on board or something like that. But it's really descriptive.
By the way, I've never had anybody buy the book for this reason, but if you're just interested in shipping, I kept a list. I wrote all the ships down. It's probably in my index if you want to go through there. She mentions dozens of ships that were entering the port and different things at different times, including the first iron ship that was ever built. It was coming from Brazil or something and landed in Galveston or something.
That's what I was just going to say.
Yes.
I mean,
and they were invited on board, so she got to go and tour it or whatever.
Man, that is so cool. And what I've done, I've read the first probably 30 or 40 pages, but because this book sits out normally in here, because I've used it just to kind of paint pictures in my videos, right? I'll read sections and then use descriptions that Lucy Parker Shaw uses,
Right.
and to paint those old 1830s, 1840s pictures in people's minds. But I'll skip through. I'll just pick it up and read a letter here and there.
That's a good deal about the book. You can do it. You can just read it like a narrative all the way through, or you can just read here or there and get an ideas about,
And you do an amazing job adding historical context in between most of the letters.
Yeah, a lot of the figures and stuff I really didn't know much about. And so I said, I try to tell you, I know if, I've got an American history degree. If I don't know really for sure who these people are, right? Then I try to tell you, this is who she's talking about. This is not a nobody, by the way, kind of thing. So when she talks about like some of the figures, like Dr. Ashbel Smith is one of her doctors. Well, even in Texas history, he's a huge figure. I don't know how many people, he's not that big anymore, but at one time he was one of the, a key figure in Texas history.
Yeah. And his building right down the street here at UTMB is the flagship building of the University of Texas Medical Branch.
It is. He's known as the founder of the Texas University. Texas is, it's kind of his, And so, he's an educator. By the way, the founder of Prairie View, he had Texas legislature pass a bill that established Prairie View University for Freeman.
I had no idea. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Man, so in the process of going through these letters and preparing them to be published, you also had to do a lot of research to add in the historical context.
Yeah, that was most of my time, was just researching. And a lot of this was not that difficult to research. It wasn't a deep dive. But you'll see the reference that I used, the things that I cited. Some of them are really rather common. You can find a lot of stuff about Texas history through Texas Historical Society, stuff like that. It's just out there very easy. But some of it was, it was a lot deeper dive into finding out who are these people and what the hell's going on here. I like the part for example, the politics is something that people will be shocked to find out is that Sam Houston was not loved by everyone. At one time, Sam Houston dissolved the Texas Navy. She talks quite a bit about that people were in Galveston, very upset because of this. And I didn't know anything about the details of the battle, but the Texas Navy beat the Mexican Navy, the the Battle of the Campeche or whatever. And in Galveston, that was thought as something that saved them because they expected the Mexican Navy to invade Texas, and they were going to land in Galveston. Burned the city down. There was no defense that they really had, and they said the Texas Navy saved them. And Sam Houston went and got rid of it. Not only that, had an arrest warrant for Commodore Hamor, which in their minds was the hero. And she talks about they They held meetings about it, and her husband was involved in that. And then they had they all met one night, and they hanged Sam Houston in effigy, and all that, hated his guts and everything kind of stuff.
It's like Sam Houston, he's the man. He won the Battle of San Jacinto.
He the man, right?
And then you get into like Galveston history. You're like, yeah, people around here didn't like him very much in the 1840s, especially when the Mexican Navy was still harassing the Texas coast through that entire period.
Absolutely. I learned that was, by the way, that battle was not the last time, the only time a fleet under sail beat a steam-powered fleet. Lucy not only meets a lot of interesting people, and you can tell her education in the thing throughout the book, but it's also very kind of heart-wrenching. One of her doctors, some of the people from Maine are interesting. She talked pretty early in this book. She mentions a doctor, Dr. Cyrus Hamlin. Now, see, this is what if you just go over something like this and you just see the name, you don't think anything about it, right? You just move on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my job was to wonder, who was Cyrus Hamlin? Well, it was pretty easy to find out who he was, because he was the brother of Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's first vice president. They lived in Paris, Maine, and his practice originally was in Calais, Maine, which is up the St. Croix River from Eastport. You go around the corner and go up this river. It's a border between Canada and Maine. And that's where his practice was. When I gave a talk in Calais, Maine, you could go out. Their historical society was in his home where he had his medical practice. They claimed he was buried there, too. You could go see his grave. But I said, they must have moved it because he died in Galveston. And she records him being buried.
Oh, so
they
he's
were
here.
all at his funeral.
So he's here somewhere.
He's here. He should be here somewhere.
And we don't. And
I've never been able to find where, and never for sure where they were burying people. They just said it was outside the city one time. That's all I know.
It's probably like 30th Street or something these days.
Maybe something. I don't really know. Yeah. She doesn't identify exactly where the burying ground was. Now, she is buried in City Cemetery out here. She's not buried with her husband, by the way. She's married with her mother-in-law, because when they came, Joshua brought his wife, their infant, Emily, and then he also brought his sister, his stepmother, and I think one other person that comes up occasionally that I had a hell of a time finding. I think it was his aunt. Okay, so he came with a crew and a lot of stuff they brought with them, okay, because they were setting up shop here. And Joshua was a carpenter. I say carpenter, he built houses. Everyone knows, well, everyone doesn't know, but the Menard House, one of the oldest buildings, was a prefab house, right? From Maine. And I've always been wondering if Joshua didn't have something to do with that, because when they got here, he built houses. And then later, he got the job of managing the Tremont. So he and his wife moved into the Tremont. And then they built a hotel for themselves. And then suddenly, 2 years go by, they're back at the Tremont. And I have no idea what happened to their hotel. But there's a lot of things. It got me involved, the idea that she comes here with her husband. And she's educated, like I said. And I'm not so sure as much about Joshua. I did throw one of his letters in there because I had it, and I just wanted the reader to just get a little taste. He's writing, I think, his son, William, because she does have a child that dies. She comes with Emily, and then she has two other children, William and Annie. William, her son, there's easy to find stuff about him. He ended up, during the Civil War, he joined, well, it was this Galveston Rifles or something like that. and then he got out of that and joined the Confederate Navy. He actually went to the Confederate Naval Academy. The only service I could find, and this, by the way, was when he passed away, the Masonic Lodge. He was a Mason, so they had a obit on him. And supposedly he served on the cruiser, whatever, Tallahassee. It was a Confederate raider.
Okay.
That sailed up the East Coast, and it took 19 prizes. It was in one trip. It was a big deal. It really harassed Yankee shipping up there. I think is an interesting side note, and again, I'm not for sure. I have to kind of dig into it a little bit deeper. They took a ship off Massachusetts, Maine, somewhere in there. They recorded it in their log. They took this ship, and the master of the ship was a guy named Captain Marston. The Marstons are related to the Shaws. And so, ergo, what I'm saying is he might have been on a ship that took a ship that was captained by a relative of his.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
That's a pretty common Civil War story, though, right? Brother fight
well, yeah,
brother,
we've
father
got the
fight
story
son.
in Galveston about what was the deal about the Battle of Galveston?
Yeah, Edward and Albert Lee, father and
Yes.
son.
Yeah.
Yeah, father and son, both on separate sides.
Right.
I think the son was on a Union Navy vessel that had taken Galveston for a few months, and then
Right.
the father was on the Confederate side, and they battled each other right here, 2 blocks away from where we are. Okay, do you know anything about Sackarap?
I looked into it briefly. It's named after Sackarat Falls. It's a beautiful little, very iconic little Maine town, right? And they have a historical society. And I sent them off in queries. So just what history tells me is we had this filibusterer age. And we know the filibusters were in Bolivar. And if you read anything about the Bolivarian revolts, you think this is all only Latin Americans. It was not. Many, many Americans were involved in these revolutions in South America and Central America, right? Some of them for nefarious reasons of trying to gather some sort of little kingdom or something, but others just because they thought it was the right thing to do. It was a patriotic kind of American kind of thing, because the idea of why does Bolivar revolt, right? Because the model was the United States did it, right? And we're going to do the same thing. So a lot of Americans were fighting against Spain. And so that can be one reason, is just this idea they were drawn down here during this filibusterer era. And or it's new land, it's arable land, there's things they can do. Although Joshua and them, he's a merchant. They're merchants. They're typical like Yankees. Yeah. I was telling my previous class audience, Lucy is the prototypical Yankee. Everything she believes in is like New England of that era, Puritan ethics, right? They're founding members of Trinity Episcopal Church, but she also befriends another Presbyterian minister named William McCalla that later on my research found out in that era was a very famous churchman. Mm-hmm. Okay, he founded churches. He started the second college in the Republic of Texas, and he was really well known. And he visited Lucy when he came down here. So they were very kind of religious. And she mentions religion occasionally and mentions getting religious books for her daughter, and children. They need to be educated. This is part of their education. She knew Gail Borden. She mentions Borden several times. People who know anything about old Galveston history know Gail Borden, Borden milk guy and all that. Mm-hmm. Talks about his garden, because he was into that horticulture thing. She was too. And also she started a school with Gail Borden. And she taught in this school until things got going and she got busy and couldn't do it anymore. But she helped Gail Borden start a school, right? Her husband was an alderman. He was head of the WARS board. You know what I mean? They're all this kind of New Englandy, Yankee kind of way of looking at the world,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
And so, as my previous talk kind of centered on that idea, that what is she bringing to Galveston? What is her and her husband, but particularly her, because the letters are from her, is they're bringing this civilized kind of like thing, right? You know, people, this is the whole idea of the frontier, you know, the Frederick Turner thesis and all this, that this country was settled in waves and there was always the frontier. Okay? You know, you start with trappers and explorers and it moves on to, and then it moves on to more wild kind of settler, and then the farmers, and then, you know, and then the merchants, and, you know, there's a pattern, you know. And so they kind of fit into this pattern of taking this wild place, right, and making it a livable place. She's interested in science. She's interested in medicine. She's interested, like I said, in religion, the civics of it, making a place. If you really look and you see who created the government here in the early eras, you're going to find most of them were people from that era, that area, right? Not just Maine and Massachusetts, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, Maryland and Pennsylvania, New York. A lot of New Yorkers settled in Galveston. So they bring this whole merchant class, this trading class, this organization, bureaucracy, and all that to Galveston.
Is there anything else you wanted to say? Any parting thoughts?
Let me read this. I'm just going to read this little passage by Eric Hoffer.
Okay.
Because it's about history and it's about the importance of studying individuals and their lives, death, how they approach life, how they look at things, society, and all of that. But also how they make us feel. As Eric Hoffer wrote, it is the individual only who is timeless. Societies, cultures, and civilizations, past and present, are often incomprehensible to outsiders. But the individual's hungers, anxieties, dreams, and preoccupations have remained unchanged through the millennia. Thus, we are up against the paradox that the individual, who is more complex, unpredictable, and mysterious than any communal entity, is the one nearest to our understanding. So near that even the interval of millennia cannot weaken our feeling of kinship. If in some manner the voice of an individual reaches us from the remotest distance of time, it is a timeless voice speaking about ourselves.